March 22, 2014. A group of motorcycle taxi drivers are combing the depths of the Soka Forest in the heart of Nigeria, looking for any trace of their missing comrade. As they ventured deeper into the dark and eerie woods, they would stumble upon a place so sinister, so horrifying, that its very existence is the stuff of nightmares. Kazim, like many others in the city, was a motorcycle taxi driver, known locally as an Okada driver. He would work long hours, navigating the busy streets of Ibadan, ferrying passengers from one place to another. One fateful day, he went out for his daily routine of picking up and dropping off passengers, but he never returned home. On the day he vanished, Kazim received a call for a seemingly routine pickup. Little did he know, it would be the last time his family would see him. His family, growing increasingly concerned about his whereabouts, began asking around in the local community to see if anyone had seen him or knew what might have happened. His fellow Okada drivers, realizing the gravity of the situation, started to piece together the puzzle from the information they received. Some passengers had mentioned that they last saw him near the outskirts of the Soka Forest, where whispers of unspeakable horrors had long echoed among the local community. Driven by their concern for their friend and the sense of camaraderie among the Okada drivers, they decided to organize a search party to find their missing colleague. These brave drivers, knowing the risks they were taking, ventured into the depths of the Soka Forest. They could not have anticipated the shocking discovery that awaited them, a scene so depraved and repugnant that it seemed as though the very earth itself shrank back in revulsion. As the group of drivers cautiously made their way through the dense undergrowth, they began to notice an unsettling stillness in the air, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to hang heavy over the trees. The further they ventured, the more they became aware of a putrid stench that wafted through the forest, growing stronger and more nauseating with each step. They noticed signs of suspicious activity, such as unusual footprints and makeshift trails. It soon became apparent that they were not alone, and they were treading on dangerous ground. Their skin crawled with the unsettling sensation of being hunted by an unseen malevolence. Finally, the group stumbled upon a dilapidated building, hidden amidst the thicket. House of Horror, as it would come to be known. What they found within its walls defied imagination, a macabre tableau of human suffering and death. Emaciated bodies lay chained to the floor or hung from the walls, their eyes hollow with despair, barely clinging to life. Decomposing corpses littered the ground, some mutilated beyond recognition, bearing the unmistakable signs of ritualistic torture. The motorcycle drivers were horrified by the gruesome scene that unfolded before their eyes. At that moment, the drivers knew they had stumbled upon something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. As the motorcycle drivers delved deeper into the House of Horror, their resolve to uncover the truth and rescue any survivors grew stronger. Guided by their instincts and an unwavering determination, they pressed on, driven by a sense of duty to their missing comrade and the countless other victims who had suffered in this hellish place. Their perseverance paid off when they found 8 survivors who were in terrible shape. Emaciated, disheveled, and covered in the scars and bruises of their harrowing ordeal, these survivors were living proof of the unspeakable atrocities that had transpired within the walls of this horrifying den. The survivors recounted their experiences in the House of Horror, detailing the cruel and inhuman treatment they had suffered. They spoke of being starved, beaten, and subjected to excruciating torture, both physical and psychological. Their captors forced them to perform unspeakable acts, exploiting their vulnerability and stripping them of their dignity and humanity. The most chilling revelation, however, was the admission by some of the survivors that they had resorted to cannibalism in order to stay alive. This grisly confession underscored the sheer desperation and desolation experienced by the captives, who had been pushed to the very edge of their moral and ethical limits. Their accounts painted a nightmarish picture of a place where the boundaries of human decency had been utterly abandoned, and where the darkest aspects of humanity reigned supreme. As the search party ventured deeper into the Abadan forest, they were met with increasingly gruesome sights. The scale of the atrocities that had taken place there was gradually revealed with each step they took. The forest, which had once concealed the dark secret of the House of Horror, now bore witness to the sheer magnitude of the human tragedy that had unfolded within its shadows. The search party was confronted by countless human remains, some of which were little more than skeletons, while others were still in the process of decomposing. The sight of these remains, scattered across the forest floor, filled the air with a palpable sense of dread and sorrow. Each one of these remains represented a life that had been violently and mercilessly extinguished by the malevolent forces that had once inhabited the House of Horror. As the search party continued to explore, they discovered personal effects belonging to the victims, scattered amidst the bones and rotting flesh. These items, which included clothing, jewelry, and other personal belongings, served as heart-wrenching reminders of the individual lives that had been shattered and the families that had been torn apart by the brutal acts perpetrated in this place of darkness. The grim scene seemed to stretch on for miles, with no end in sight. It was reported that over 50 skulls were recovered from the forest, each one a haunting testament to the enormity of the tragedy that had taken place. The Abadan House of Horror was a nightmarish hub for human traffickers and ritualists who targeted the most vulnerable members of society: orphans, the homeless, and the desperate. These nefarious individuals saw their victims as nothing more than a means to an end, fueling the dark appetites of the wealthy and powerful in Nigeria and beyond. Within the decrepit walls of the House of Horror, countless innocent souls were subjected to unspeakable torture, abuse, and murder. The victims were often lured with promises of employment, shelter, or even love, only to be ensnared in a web of cruelty from which there was no escape. The ritualists who operated within the House of Horror were driven by a twisted belief that they could harness the power of the life force within their victims. They performed barbaric rituals which often involved the removal of body parts or the consumption of human flesh and blood in the misguided hope that it would bring them wealth, power, or supernatural abilities. In addition to the ritualistic killings, the Abadan Forest of Horror was a hub for human trafficking, with victims being bought and sold like commodities. Men, women, and children were forced into labor, sexual exploitation, or even organ harvesting, their lives cruelly snuffed out for the benefit of others. When the authorities finally arrived on the scene, the situation was already desperate and horrifying. The search party, having uncovered the gruesome remains and the victims' personal effects, hoped that the police would bring some measure of justice and closure to this harrowing ordeal. However, their actions only served to exacerbate the horror. Instead of conducting a thorough forensic investigation, which would have allowed the careful collection of evidence and the identification of the victims, the authorities hastily buried the dead in a mass grave. This decision was not only disrespectful to the memory of those who had perished, but also denied the families of the missing the chance to identify their loved ones and obtain closure. The mass grave, rather than providing a dignified resting place for the victims, became a symbol of the authorities' negligence and lack of empathy. The families of the missing, who had been clinging to the hope of finding their loved ones alive, or at least getting answers about their fates, were left in anguish. The authorities' hasty actions meant that many families would never know for certain whether their loved ones were among the victims buried in the mass grave. The heartbreak and uncertainty that they experienced only served to deepen the sense of tragedy and injustice surrounding the Ibadan Forest of Horror. In the aftermath of the mass burial, public outrage grew over the authorities' handling of the situation. Accusations of incompetence, corruption, and indifference swirled around the police and government officials responsible for managing the case. This added another layer of tragedy to the already horrific tale of the Ibadan Forest of Horror, as it became evident that not only had unimaginable atrocities been committed, but that the very institutions meant to protect the public and ensure justice had failed in their duties. The shocking discovery of the Ibadan Forest of Horror prompted an intensified focus on addressing human trafficking and ritualistic crimes in Nigeria. As law enforcement agencies and concerned citizens became more vigilant, several other dens of horror were uncovered, exposing the sinister underworld that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. In the months and years following the Soka Forest ordeal, authorities and local communities worked together to identify and dismantle these criminal hideouts. Many of these dens were located in remote or forested areas, similar to the Soka Forest, making them difficult to detect and access. In some cases, tip-offs from brave citizens who noticed suspicious activities led to the discovery of these criminal lairs.